Nature is both the gentlest mother and as a wind like a bugle. Poems on Nature by Emily Dickinson. Before beginning to discuss the actual nature poems in this recital, I wanted to just share some facts about Emily's family life and her background as an individual. She grew up with two siblings. One was older, one was younger. Her brother Austin was her older brother, and she had a very close relationship with him. She wrote many letters to him when he was away from home, whether he was working or in school, and we find out a lot about Emily herself and her thoughts about being away from home and even her isolation through these letters. Her sister Lavinia never married, and the two of them lived together in their family's home up until Emily's death. They were very close, and Lavinia seemed to be very helpful for Emily, even as she became more and more eccentric into her adult life. Her parents, although it seems that they were relatively good parents, were not as close with Emily as her siblings were. She seemed to have a strained relationship, particularly with her mother, and even her father. It doesn't seem that they were very close. Her mother may have been somewhat of a distant mother and perhaps did not give her the love and the care that she would have liked. And so it seems that she may have had some resentment towards her mom. So it seems that they had a fairly happy upbringing, although the relationship she shared with her parents was not as strong as the ones that she shared with her siblings. She also had friends during her childhood. She attended school and made friends. They seemed to only be female friends, however. She did not interact with male friends as much, it seems. And many of these childhood friends, she actually continued to stay in contact with them as she became an adult. She would write to them, and many of her friendships throughout her life were through letters, and her friends that she met in school were no exception. Susan was a particular friend that she had, and Susan actually married Austin, so she became her sister-in-law. But Susan's friendship was unlike her other friendships. She seemed to rely on Susan to provide almost a motherly figure to her. Perhaps this is because she did not have a great relationship with her actual mother. She sought out the friendship of Susan to be kind of a stand-in mother for her. She wrote to her throughout her life, and actually Susan was in charge of writing her obituary. And one of the poems in this recital is one that she included in that obituary. They had a close relationship, and even though it was so close, even with Susan, especially later in life, Emily chose to maintain this friendship largely with letters rather than in-person conversations. She also had many other correspondents that she communicated with. Some of them, as I mentioned, with her childhood friends, she had known and been friends with and had in-person relationships with, but many of them she had never even met, and the only way she knew them was through letters. She was not opposed to friendship, even though, as we'll talk later, she was an isolated person. later in life especially. She did communicate with many people and sought the opinions of others and even sought friendship. Emily's religious background was largely Congregationalist. Her family was a very religious family. They were Congregationalists, and as was typical in New England at that time, they had a strong Puritan background, and in general, people tended to be very religious and to follow the traditional Puritan religion, which focused a lot on the Bible. So she was very well versed in the Bible and in biblical teachings. However, she did not seem to accept the Bible as necessarily the absolute truth. She seemed to believe in God, yet she did not follow the Bible as her family did. Her father read the Bible in the home, so she was very well acquainted with its teachings, yet she did not choose to accept them for herself, and she did not convert to her family's Congregationalist beliefs. She also did not accept Transcendentalism, which was a movement which was also common around that time, and it dealt with nature a lot, which might seem that it would appeal to her since she did enjoy nature so much, but she did not convert to that either. She didn't hold the beliefs of Emerson, who was a leader in the Transcendentalist movement. So she really was independent in her religious beliefs. She didn't condemn the Bible or the teachings that are found in it, but she did not embrace them either. Her gardens seemed to be her place of worship. Rather than a church, she looked to nature and her own reasonings for her convictions rather than following the convictions of others. If I is a song which points to some of Emily's religious beliefs. It doesn't outline her beliefs, but it does show her perspective in what really mattered in life. She wanted to ensure that her life was not in vain, and how she decided that it would not be in vain was by doing good things. She mentions helping a robin and doing good both to humans and to those animals and things in nature. So she's not specifically being religious in this poem, but she's showing what she really valued in life. And typically, for most of us, what we value in life stems from our religious beliefs. So I think this shows she really valued nature, and she really valued kindness and goodness and compassion. And although those can have the roots found in Christianity, such as the Congregationalist beliefs, she did not specifically hold to them, but I'm sure that they influenced her, especially since almost all of her friends and her family held to these beliefs. Lateman's setting of this poem is very beautiful. It's very tonal. It's quite simple, yet I think she captures the word stress that Emily Dickinson was meaning for the poem to have. She uses gorgeous harmonies and fairly simple melody that continues to be repeated, yet she changes it just enough to keep it interesting. I think her way in which she sets this poem just demonstrates the simplicity of what Emily Dickinson thought was important.
If I can stop one heart from breaking, I shall not live in vain. If I can ease one life aching, or cool one pain, or help one fainting robin unto his nest again, I shall not live in vain. I shall not live in vain. I shall not live in I shall not live in vain. I shall not live in vain. I shall not
An interesting aspect of Emily Dickinson was the isolation, and I think we all think of her as being a hermit. She became more and more isolated as she aged and as she became an adult. And there are some interesting theories as to why she made this choice, because it was a conscious choice. It wasn't that she had to be isolated for any specific reason. She chose that for her life. So one thought is that she made this decision as a way to self-preserve. She may have felt such a fear of losing those that she loved that she chose to remove herself from them already, rather than letting them be taken from her. She really had a keen interest in other people, and she seemed to have very deep connections. So this explanation would explain why she removed herself from these people who she clearly loved very much. Another thought on why she may have isolated was she wanted to become more one with nature. And perhaps since she does have so many nature poems, this was an attempt to really isolate in order to think about and contemplate nature and life and immortality. She did have a lot of serious thoughts, and it seems that she may have embraced this sort of hermetism in order to really allow herself to think through things and not to be influenced by the thinking of others, but really to seek truth or seek her own beliefs on her own without the influence of others. However, she did suffer from loneliness, and it seems that this may have been a difficult thing for her to deal with. Although it was a personal choice, she still seemed to miss that connection that she kept from herself. So Silence is a song which seems to speak of isolation, and it mentions infinity, and it seems that this is a contemplation on death. She talks about silence is all we dread, and the question seems to arise, is silence that she's speaking of, is that the silence of death, or is that the silence of being isolated from others? What is this silence, and what does she mean by it? She's contemplating also, it seems, immortality, and as she mentions infinity throughout this piece. So this is an interesting poem. I think it speaks to her isolation from others and her just her serious contemplations that she had, whether they were in her garden, whether they were in her room, but she seemed to have a lot of very somber, sober thoughts. Heggie sets this piece in a really beautiful way. And when you first look at the score, it does not seem that this piece is going to have anything to do with silence. There's just constant motion in the piano part, and it just does not look like it would be silent at all. But that constant motion acts kind of like a white noise almost. There's not really, that constant motion isn't really a melody. It's just maybe the breeze or waves or something that Heggie is referring to. And then there's this beautiful melody that goes above and below the inner voice, which is just this sort of white noise. And then the vocal line comes in, and that just seems to blanket all of it. And I think he took an unusual approach setting a poem like this, but I think it really works. And I found this a beautiful piece to sing. publishing her poems, Emily Dickinson didn't really show any interest in doing this. She wanted her poems to be very good as she sought out the opinions of others about her poetry, but she didn't share very much of it with anyone. No one knew how much Emily had written until after her death, not even her family and friends. So this seems to be a choice that she wanted to kind of remain unknown, and it maybe goes along with her desire for isolation and seclusion, but she didn't want to be published. Only 10 poems were published during her lifetime, and she did not instigate any of those. It was her family and friends who published them. After her death, many of her poems were published, but during her lifetime, she did not pursue it. She did not seem to want the fame that came with publication. And moving right into that, her poem about fame compares fame to a bee. And most of us, the first thing we think of when we think of a bee is a bee sting. So perhaps she was referring to the pain that can come along with fame. She also mentions positive things about fame, however. She mentions the song that a bee has, and she mentions the wing that a bee has, which perhaps she meant the wing as, when it comes to fame, that often fame flies away just like a bee. But after her poems were published, she certainly has fame that has not flown away. Heggie set this piece in a descriptive way. I think the piano part imitates that buzz of the honeybee or whatever type of bee buzzing between flowers. And it also has, for instance, on the word song, it's very descriptive. There's this beautiful descending line on the word song as it's creating this little melismatic phrase. He also specifies for the singer to elongate certain consonants in order to imitate the sound of a bee. So the Z sounds, he sets them way before they come in. He indicates that you should start that, like the S sound on the word sting. He indicates that the singer should start that S well before the actual pitch arrives. So his setting of this is very short, it's to the point, but I think he demonstrates his thought process throughout this. In some of Emily Dickinson's nature poems, she uses personification in order to express herself. In Nature, the Gentlest Mother, she personifies nature as a mother and the things in nature as her children. I think this is very interesting. As we mentioned earlier, she did not have the best of relationships with her own mother. Yet, when she's talking about nature, she is saying that nature is the gentlest mother, and she is taking care of her children, and she is putting them to sleep, and she's watching over them, and she's rebuking them sometimes in this poem. So even though she did not have the best of relationships with her own mother, she still apparently appreciated a mother figure, and she made nature in this poem that wonderful, loving mother figure. This whole poem is basically set as a family. So she shows the little children. In some parts of the poem, the little children are behaving themselves very nicely. In other parts of the poem, the mother is having to get after them a little bit. But I think this is just a beautiful poem. It's just very expressive in the way she sets it. Copeland set this poem very beautifully. He is very fond, it seems, of using a little bit more advanced harmonies and a little more dissonance throughout his poem, throughout his settings. But this piece really uses those aspects of his compositional style to create this beautiful arrangement in which you can imagine that you're hearing birds chirping and maybe the grass rustling, and it's just a beautiful, beautiful descriptive setting. Good Morning Midnight is another poem in which Emily Dickinson uses personification. She is personifying both day and night as people. She, or the speaker, is a little girl who seems to be looking to gain acceptance from the day and the night. She seems to like day better, yet day has not accepted her, as she says in the text. So it's unclear exactly what she's referring to. If she's taking this as very literally, perhaps she couldn't sleep. This poem is very gripping, and it's a very dramatic poem. Previn, I think, set this drama very well. He uses leaps and some unusual intervals, and I think it enhances the drama and perhaps maybe a little bit of the ambiguity of the poem. His harmonies are not overwhelmingly tonal, or they instead use some dissonances that a composer such as Lori Laitman did not use in her If I that we looked at. But I think this setting is very descriptive of the longing for acceptance and the perhaps a little bit of confusion.
Good morning, midnight, I'm coming home. Day got tired of me, how could I of him? Sunshine was a sweet place, I liked to stay, but Monday and what we know, so good night, day. I can look, can't I, when this is red? The hills have a way then that puts the heart on red. Yeah, I'm not so fair. I chose please take a little girl. He turned
When looking at the title as imperceptibly as grief, it almost seems like, why is this poem in this nature set? It looks as if the poem is going to be all about sadness and loss, but it's actually a poem about the changing of the seasons. And Emily Dickinson seemed to associate different feelings with different seasons. So she loved the summertime. And perhaps it's understandably so, as she was an avid gardener and she loved her gardens. We mentioned earlier that her gardens were her church. And she had this great love for summer. But this poem is talking about the change from summer into autumn. And autumn seemed to bring about thoughts that were more serious for Emily Dickinson. Thoughts about life, thoughts about eternal life, perhaps thoughts about immortality. So, as imperceptibly as grief is actually just a song about the changing of the seasons. And Previn sets this piece. Again, he tends to use a little bit more advanced harmonies than some of the other composers in this recital. But I think he sets this piece so that it emphasizes the changing that's taking place in the words.
As imperceptibly as grief, the summer lapsed away. Time perceptible at last, to seem like every day. A quietness disturbed as twilight long began, and nature spending with herself sequestered after dusk drew earlier in, the morning light shone. A courteous, yet heroine grace, as guest that might be and thus without a wing, I saw the keel. I summer made her light escape into the
The Grass So Little Has to Do just shows Emily Dickinson's love of the mundane things in nature. Most people, I don't think, notice grass very much, But she writes this poem about grass, and interestingly, she almost is jealous of the grass. At the end of the poem, she says, "I wish I were a hay." And she's just discussing the wonder of this grass and how beautiful it is, and how even after it dies, it's just this incredible thing, and it still smells beautiful, and it stays in the sovereign barns, as she says, and it's just this most fascinating thing that most of us take for granted. I think Bacon captures some of this simplicity yet beauty in his setting of it. It's not complicated, but it just is that simple melody, and I think he did a great job at capturing just the simplicity and the admiration of something so simple in this setting.
The grass so little has to do, a sphere of simple green, with only butterflies to brood, or bees to entertain. And stir on day to pretty tunes, the breezes fetch along. And hold the sun shining its lamp, and water everything. And bring it as a night like hers, and make itself so fine. A duchess were too common for such an otising. And even when it dies, to passing on is so divine, these lowly spices gone to sleep, or rivulets of pine. And then to dwell in sovereign bonds, and dream the days away. The grass so little has to do, I wish I were a hay.
Another poem about the seasons is Alabaster Wool. This is a poem about winter, and it would have been understandable for Emily Dickinson to abhor winter, since she was such an avid gardener and she loved her gardens, but from this poem it doesn't seem that she did. She paints a very beautiful picture of a snow scene in this poem. You can almost imagine her thinking about what maybe the New England landscape looked like in the winter. And it's very descriptive, and it gives a very clear visual image about what she's talking about. You can picture the snow climbing up the fence. Another interpretation of this poem has a more supernatural meaning, which would again tie it back towards her religious beliefs. But however it's interpreted, I think it just shows Emily Dickinson's ability to depict an image, even to the extent that you can grasp it without being there. I think Bacon set this piece in a very beautiful and descriptive way. The piano part just whirls and twirls as if it's the descending snow from the skies, and as it's talking about the snow rising, the vocal line just soars upward. And I love the way that he set the word been at the end of the song. It's referring to the ghosts that they have been, and it's a haunting little melody as it goes up and down, and it just sounds like the ghosts that have been. He was very descriptive in both the piano part and in the vocal line. I think this is just a very beautiful setting. It's not as simple as his setting of The Grass So Little Has to Do. It's definitely more complicated, but it's just so beautiful and so descriptive of the text.
It sifts from leaden sieves, it powders all the wood, it fills with alabaster all the wrinkles of the road. It makes an even face of golden light of play, unbroken forehead from the east unto the east again. It reaches to the fence, it wraps it reverent, till it is lost in fleeces, in It rains a grace to rain on summer's haggard stem, the summer's empty round, acres of seams where harvest time, requitless but for It ruffles wrists of post, ties ankles of a queen, then steals its artisans like ghosts, denying they have
There Came a Wind Like a Bugle is very different from the other poems that we've looked at by Emily Dickinson. She's not depicting nature as a gentle mother in this poem. Instead, she's showing the power in nature and maybe even her fear of nature. Nature is not a loving force in this. Instead, nature is seen as creating havoc for the people. It's destroying their homes. It's not working together with the humans. Instead, they're at odds with one another. The humans are trying to protect themselves in this poem, while nature is destroying it, destroying not only not only itself, but also the dwellings of the people. It talks about the rivers where the houses were. And this is just very, very different than the other poems that we've looked at. Copland's setting of this piece is very effective in creating that disjointed feeling. The scale that opens up this piece is very dissonant, as it's not in unison at all. It's very, very disturbing almost to listen to the piano part. It doesn't work with itself as is representing the nature and how it's not working with itself. It's destroying itself. And the harmonies are very intense. The melody is very intense. This just is very descriptive, though, of the text. I think he did a great job in describing what's going on in the text through the musical setting.
There came a wind like a bugle, it came through the grass, and a great chill upon the heath so ominous did pass. We bide the window and the doors, eyes firmly emerald cast. Thy doom's electric moccasin, they for instant past. On the strange planting trees and fences fled away. The rivers where the houses ran, the living mourned thy death. The bell within the steeple wild the flowing tidings wailed. How much can come and much can go, and yet abide the world.
To Make a Prairie is very different from There Came a Wind Like a Bugle. This piece shows the imagination of Emily Dickinson. She's saying that despite being in Amherst in New England, a prairie can be imagined through the use of simply a clover, a bee, and reverie. And later on she says even the clover and the bee aren't even necessary. You just need imagination. A deeper meaning of this one is how culture is actually a result from nature. And this poem, interestingly, was also the poem which Emily Dickinson's sister-in-law, Susan, included in her obituary, which seems like an interesting choice, but this was the poem that she felt would represent Emily Dickinson. So Laurie Laitman is the composer who set this piece that is in this recital, and her setting is very simple but very beautiful. It's quite tonal. It has a lot of soaring sections that seem to represent the reverie. I love how it has these natural ritardandos on the high notes when we're singing the word reverie. I think it's just a beautiful setting. Again, the melody is simple, the harmonies are simple, but I think that just goes with the simple imagination of creating this prairie, even if it's just in one's mind.
the reverie alone will do. If bees are few.
The final set in the recital is a set of Will There Really Be a Morning? This is a poem which is questioning in a childlike way some of the very basic aspects of nature, day and night. And I think it's interesting how she just pleads to know the answer. Will there really be a morning? And another interesting thing about this poem is it brings back the religious imagery that is so prevalent in Emily Dickinson's poems, and it brings back what we were talking about with her religious background as a Congregationalist and not fully accepting those beliefs, yet still having a large amount of knowledge about the Christian faith. So some of the things in this poem which call back to memory the religious imagery are things like morning and day and how they're in quotation marks and how that's important. But also things like water lilies, has its feet like water lilies, referencing to walking on water, which of course is found in the New Testament, and feathers like a bird, referring to angels' wings. So this poem can be interpreted as just more than simple childlike questioning, but I think there is also that aspect of it where she's just asking, will there really be a morning? Is there such a thing as day? And it brings about her thoughts on nature and her reflective attitude. So the settings that are included are Bacon, Hundley, Lateman, and Previn, and each one of these is very different from the other ones. Bacon's version is quite short, and it just states the text. Will there really be a morning? Is there such a thing as day? I think he did a very good job at capturing that simplicity of that childlike questioning in his setting. Hundley's version is very beautiful. I think he tries to emphasize certain words, although not necessarily with the highest pitch in the phrase, but sometimes with note values. His version is marked with this beautiful melody that just continues throughout the whole thing. Lateman, I think, really thought about the words and which words she wanted to emphasize. So this entire opening phrase, will there really be a morning, it just leads right up to the word morning. She also tries to capture some of the ways in which we speak naturally. She has a descending interval on morning so that we're not emphasizing the wrong part of the word. Her version is very descriptive in the way she set the text. And then finally, Previn. Previn's version is very frantic, especially while asking the question, will there really be a morning? The piano part is almost hectic as it just begs the question, will there really be a morning? And then the B section, has it feet like water lilies, gets kind of contemplative as you're thinking about, does it really have feet like water lilies? Does it have feathers like a bird? And then at the ending, it just returns to the frantic questioning. So all four of these settings are very different, but I think each composer captures a different aspect of this text. Will there really be a morning?
Will there really be a morning? Is there such a thing as see it from the mountains, if I were as tall as they. Has its feet like water lilies, has its feathers like a bird. Is it brought from famous countries, which I have never heard? Oh, some scholar, or some sailor, or some wise man from the skies, please to tell our little pilgrim where the place called lies. Will there really be a morning? Is there such a thing as day? Could I see it from the mountains, if I were as tall as they? Has its feet like water lilies? Has its feathers like a bird? Is it brought from famous countries, of which I have never heard? Oh, please to tell our little pilgrim where it lays Will there really be a morning? Is there such a thing as Will there really be a morning? Is there such a thing as day? Could I see it from the mountains, if I were as tall as they? Has its feet like water lilies? Has its feathers like a bird?